You ever looked at a really cool piece of hardware and thought, I'd love to use that, but I'm in post and that's for people who do music? There's actually a long history of hardware gear used in post-production. And while it's true that technology has evolved and has pushed us more and more into the digital space, where things like plugins are super easy to carry around with iLok activation, settings are easy to transport and recall, why would we ever bother with the hassle of hardware gear? Well, hardware still has a lot of potential here for us in the post-audio space. And not a lot of people are talking about it or doing reviews or comparisons within the context of the post space. There's tons of stuff out there for people who do music, but what about the people who work on film, TV, and games? Moving forward with this channel, I'm going to be doing more of these hardware reviews and talk about the difference between the software versions and the hardware versions and whether they're right for you and your workflow. Well, that's enough talking from me because I'm super excited to share for my first hardware review today that I have managed to get my hands on a super rare AudioScape Golden 58. This thing is an absolutely beautiful piece of gear. This is a 2-channel preamp. It has got 6 tubes inside of it, 3 per channel, and a massive transformer on the back of it. This thing sounds great. There were only about 300 of these made in total, and the only place to find them nowadays is secondhand on the used market. I was lucky enough that Will Files' Instagram handle @SoundDroid was willing to lend me his that he just got. So my goal is to talk about how I would actually use this in my process for sound design, and to compare it to the plugin and see in what ways they're similar and in what ways one might be better than the other. This unit does really well at adding warmth and saturation to your signal, and when you crank it up, full-on distortion. So my goal for the review, and what I always look for in other people's reviews of hardware units and plugins, is not only what it will do in the sort of safe zone of what you would normally use it for, but also what happens when you go all the way. So that's enough for me. I'm gonna get this thing in the rack and we're gonna test it out. All right, so here we are in Pro Tools. I've got a string of sounds here that I wanna run through. And what I'm gonna start by doing is just letting you hear this unit by itself, because I think it's a really beautiful sounding unit. I just want to kind of show the range of what it can do across some of these files, and then we'll get into the actual comparison of the hardware unit versus the plugin. So here we go. I'm just going to start playing some of these sounds. I'm going to start with the knobs here at the noon position, and then I'm just going to play around and see what we can get. All the way. That is some crunchy distortion. It's nice, but it's not too crunchy. It's fat. Back to the noon position. Here's the next sound. Let's just go ahead and crank that up. And all the way. All right, how about on these gunshots? I'm just gonna leave it full up. This back down at noon. So you can hear how it's squashing those transients. But it's adding to the body of it significantly. So here it is again. So this would probably work great in parallel, where you get the snappiness of the transient from the gunshot plus the body and the added warmth from the tubes. One thing that's so lovely about this unit is that it doesn't choke the low end at all. All of that low end stays really punchy, defined, and it has this like weight to it that a lot of people have described online, but I really felt it when I started running stuff through this. All right, not last but not least, I've got a drum loop here for any of the music people listening. I'm going to give this even more input gain just so we can really drive it and see what it sounds like. So just reset. So there we have it. I mean, I hope you guys are listening to this on headphones or out of a good speaker system. This thing just sounds so robust. It's got some great tone and coloration, especially when it's driven, but it still retains all of the low end definition and weight, which is something that I think really is where hardware tends to shine, is especially in the manipulation, saturation, and representation of low end information. So now we're going to jump into it. We're going to look at the hardware versus the plugin settings, and we're going to see how that goes. All right, so here we are. Now I just want to look at how the plugin stacks up against the hardware unit, and also to describe my process on how I ran these. So I've got the green files up here. These are the unrendered raw files. The only thing that's been applied to them is some clip gain to get them more or less in a ballpark for review here. The blue files that you see are the Golden 58 plugin, and the yellow files are the Golden 58 hardware. I'm going to pull open the plugin here. As you can see, it is very close to an exact representation of the hardware unit, but we've got some bias trims here, some output gain trim here. There's an auto gain function that you can engage on the plugin, and then you can link the channels, which is nice, so both sides move at the same time. The default position here is, again, right at noon, and we've got the on-off bypass here, line mic, polarity flip, and then there is a full and a voice mode here, and basically what that is, which is also on the hardware unit, basically what that is when you put it in voice mode, it does a gentle roll off of the low end, which is often what music engineers want when they're recording vocals. So obviously I tried to match these as closely as possible. It turns out the plugin gives out a lot less gain output, so I had to do a significant amount of level balancing, level matching after the fact. But I'm basically just doing that with clip gain, and the goal was just to level match so that we're really focusing on the characteristics of the audio when processed through the plugin versus when processed through the hardware unit, and not the level differences. So I'm going to just run through these real quick. This is going to be quick compares. I'm not going to do a whole lot of talking through these, but what you should know is that on this first row here, we compared the signal at midnight, and then on the next row we compare it here at somewhere about 2 o'clock, pointed towards this auto gain, and then all the way up, because why not? Really want to hear how this unit sounds at the extremes on both the plugin and the hardware unit. So I think I'm going to go vertically down these stacks so that we get used to hearing the same material, and I'm going to just A/B back and forth a few times on each one and see what we think. So to start off, here's the raw file. This is unprocessed. One more time. And here it is at noon on the plugin. Already giving some saturation. Hardware. One of the strange things that I found about this plugin, and I'd be curious to know more about it, really has to do with the difference in how it responds in the plugin in line versus mic. So mic signals are very low compared to line level signals. So with what a preamp really does is when you plug a microphone into it and you crank it through gain, it's raising the output level to a line level. But what a lot of these units can do, both software and hardware, is they will accept a line level input so that you can process sounds through them that are already at line level and not mic level. What's interesting is that I found that overall, in order for the response to match between the hardware and the software, is I had to put the software in mic mode even though the hardware was in line mode. One of the things that I just tried is when I open up this audio suite, if I put it in line mode and I render, it doesn't do a whole lot of change, which is sort of to be expected because this is more or less at unity when it's at noon like this. When I flip it to mic mode, it does quite a bit of distortion, which is also to be expected because it's expecting a much lower input. Therefore, the same amount of signal is going to distort more quickly. However, once I got up into the higher levels, I needed to switch it to the mic mode in order to get the same level of distortion. So for example, this was processed in mic mode, but if I do it in line mode and crank it, it barely affects the signal, right? Like here's before and after, and it's barely a difference. Whereas if I put it in mic mode and crank it, now you can see it's flattened into a tube, which is much more reminiscent of the behavior of the hardware unit. So it's a bit tricky, this comparison. Like I said, it was kind of harder to put together than I expected it to be, but nonetheless, the good thing is that you have the flexibility in the plugin here of achieving either very subtle tones or extreme saturated tones, depending on what you're looking for. Okay, so back to the compare. Here it is in plugin. Here it is in the hardware unit. So they all sound more or less the same, which was kind of to be expected because we're using an analog sound to begin with, and everything was set to unity. So, all right, next up. Here it is with it set at around 2 o'clock. Here's the software and hardware. I gotta be honest, these sound pretty close. With this particular file at these settings matched, and the software unit being in mic mode, it sounds very similar. So I gotta say, the software guys here have done an excellent job with this emulation. It's almost indistinguishable. Here it is at the most extreme setting. This is with the gain turned all the way up on the software and the hardware. Software. Here's hardware. Again, very, very close. This is really splitting hairs. I don't know that I hear a massive difference between these two, especially when they're level matched. Now, what's interesting is you will see I had to push this level up by 13 dB, and I pulled all of the hardware unit recordings down by 3 just to allow for the headroom. Okay, next file. Here it is raw. And here's our plugin at noon. Hardware. Hardware. Software. Okay, here are the settings at 2 o'clock. Significantly more saturation. Here's the hardware. So this saturation sounds pretty different because there's a little bit more of a top end sort of crackle in the hardware unit. And the software doesn't have that. The distortion in the software unit is a bit muddier. It's a bit more flumpy down in the lower range. The hardware stays more defined and clean in the low end, but it breaks up a little bit differently in the top end. So here it is at the extreme settings. Here's the software and hardware. Software. Hardware. Pretty significant difference there. This is where hardware and software really start to differentiate themselves, especially in the representation of the low end signal. So a lot of this sort of higher end crackle that we get, I think is coming from the transformer outputs that are on this thing. And that is something that I find software has a much harder time of emulating. So to be honest, it's not that the plugin tone is worse, it's just different. It just has a thicker, sort of bubblier, muddier low end. Whereas the hardware unit is just slightly crunchier in tone. So kind of just depends on what you're going for, but both are interesting and good saturations. Okay, here's the gunshots. Here's the software at noon. Hardware. Here they are at 2 o'clock. Pretty close. You know, I do think that the hardware unit here has a little bit more defined snap in the transient. It's not squashing quite as hard as the plugin, and it's slightly more rolled off. The plugin is a little brighter in this example. So here it is at the extreme settings. And the hardware. Software. Yeah, so I think the software is a little bit crunchier in this one, a little bit brighter up top. This one keeps the snap a little bit more defined and is a little darker in its coloration. All right, next file. Okay, here we are with the settings at noon. Yeah, a little darker on the hardware unit. And it's more broken up more quickly because it was in mic mode on the plugin. All right, so down here at the 2 o'clock settings again. And the extreme. So in this particular example, in the extreme setting, I actually think they sound almost identical at the extreme settings. The transformers sound, sort of crackle, distortion, saturation really comes through well in the plugin here. Next we've got a synthetic sound. Here's the raw. Okay, so here we are at the 2 o'clock settings. Yeah, so the hardware unit still sounds a little cleaner to me. I prefer it for the stereo image it's giving. And here we are with the extreme settings. And I'll do the same thing again. I'm just going to loop it through, and the second time around will be the hardware. I think I prefer the hardware on this one too, on this particular sample. Here's some underwater bubbles I recorded using hydrophones. You will notice in the extreme settings that there is an inherent sort of buzz noise floor that comes up at the end of this recording. And that's just as a result of the type of microphone, the hydrophones I was using, not really the fault of the software or the hardware preamps. Here's our hardware. Something that just feels a little bit more 3D about the hardware in this one to me. It's not compressing as much. The saturation is allowing the material to breathe a little bit better, and that low end extension is pretty amazing. Here we are at the extreme settings, software, hardware. It's pretty subtle, but in the hardware, I don't know if you can hear this, it's allowing the transient snap to feel a little bit more three-dimensional in this final bubble click here. It's just a little bit more squashed in the digital one, and I tend to like the openness of the hardware unit here. Again, I'm really splitting hairs, but this is the sort of detail you're after when you're making a purchase like a hardware unit like this. It's just worth pointing out again here to anybody that was concerned about seeing these in bypass every time I was playing them. It's because I actually rendered these with an audio suite, and the insert here is in bypass just to represent what the settings were when I rendered them. So it's not like I'm playing the raw audio and forgetting to turn this on. Okay, so here we are at our 2 o'clock settings. Yeah, again, I think these are very similar. Like the software is doing a very good job of emulating here, but I think in the hardware unit I'm getting a little bit more definition, especially in the really small transient response of some of the sort of like bubbly, ticky things at the top. Here's our extreme settings. Okay, and now last but not least, our drum sample. Okay, so here's the raw. Okay, here's our 2 o'clock position settings. I have a hard time telling these two apart, to be honest. There's a little bit more saturation in the plugin, but they're pretty close. Here's our extreme settings. I feel like we get a little bit more knock out of the bass down here. I think the thicker sound on the hardware is doing a good job here. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty thorough walkthrough of this unit and its capabilities on both the software and the hardware side. And I gotta say, I think they did an excellent job modeling this plugin. I think it comes very close, especially when you're paying a fraction of the price. It really does get the job done in a lot of respects. And through these examples, you could hear that depending on the type of content that you're throwing through it and how hard you're pushing it, there are some examples in here where I found it pretty much indistinguishable from the hardware unit. And the places that I was picking out the difference between the hardware and the software really came down to the finer details. Now, something to understand about hardware in general is that people say, well, you can get 90% of the way there and you're only paying $100 for a plugin. Why would I spend, $2,000 on a piece of hardware? And the answer is for the rest of that 10%. Now, when we're doing A/B comparisons like this, going between a software unit and a hardware unit, we are directly comparing the differences between the two. We are literally A/Bing. And in a real world scenario, if you were to listen to a track that had been run through the software and then listen to a track that had been run through the hardware with even just 10 minutes in between those playbacks, you may not necessarily be able to tell the difference. But the summation, especially when you're running a long hardware chain of 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, begins to add up, and that is the reason for the investment. There's also just something really to be said for having hardware knobs and a tactile feel, and the ability, especially if you were doing like a riser or something, to start with the knobs low and to be able to manually pull them up. Of course, you can automate this and do this in a plugin, but to be honest, it's pretty satisfying to do in real life. And I gotta say, this hardware unit is exceptional in its build quality. All the knobs and switches feel really great. Anybody who's lucky enough to have gotten their hands on one of these or to purchase one on the secondhand market will really enjoy it. So that's it for my review of the AudioScape Golden 58. I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. I'm going to try to do more hardware and software comparisons in the future. I've got several other units that I'd love to run through and more in the future. Let me know down in the comments if you found this type of review useful, and I'll see you in the next one.